Trump and Putin, the most troubling relationship. Now we arrive at the darkest and most complicated part of this episode, the relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And before I say anything else, let me be absolutely clear. I am not claiming Trump is a Russian agent. I am not claiming there's a hidden file somewhere in Moscow controlling him. I am not claiming secret tapes or conspiratorial puppetry. That's not my point. What I am saying is something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Donald Trump has an instinctual admiration for authoritarian strongmen, and Vladimir Putin is at the top of that list. You don't need to be a geopolitical analyst to notice it. It has been visible for years. It is evident in Trump's speech patterns, visible in his interviews. This is evident in his body language whenever the mention of Putin is brought up. Trump doesn't speak about Putin the way a U.S. president should speak about a hostile foreign leader. He speaks about him almost like a role model, someone he respects, envies, and maybe even aspires to be. Trump's unusual praise for Putin. Let's remember the straightforward facts. Trump publicly called Putin smart, savvy, a genius, and even a strong leader, often in contexts where Putin was doing something violently destructive or geopolitically destabilizing. And Trump delivered these lines with a certainty that shocked not only American audiences, but also allies across Europe, especially those of us living close to Russian borders. Admiration for Putin doesn't feel like an opinion. Admiration for Putin feels like a warning sign. An American president praising an authoritarian aggressor isn't normal. It isn't strategic. It isn't diplomatic. It reveals something about Trump's worldview, a worldview shaped by dominance, strength, and the desire to appear feared rather than respected. Meanwhile, Putin was violating NATO airspace. While Trump was praising Putin, Russia was doing what Russia always does, testing boundaries, pushing limits, and violating international norms. And they did it boldly. Russian drones entered Polish airspace. Russian missiles fell into Romanian territory. Russian jets violated Estonian skies. Our region, Central and Eastern Europe, was living under constant tension. Newspapers in Poland, Romania, Moldova, and the Baltics repeatedly reported these incursions. The people in this region were not amused. We weren't amused. We were watching a dangerous game unfold at our doorstep. And how did Trump react? He responded with ambiguous remarks, dismissive shrugs. His response amounted to little more than a dismissive cough. A leader does not respond this way when a hostile power probes his allies. It's how someone reacts when they don't fully grasp the stakes, or worse, when they refuse to grasp them. The Alaska meeting. Symbolism that should frighten us. And then there's the moment almost nobody talks about. Trump meeting Putin on U.S. military soil in Alaska. Let that sink in. A Russian president, during an era of escalating aggression, stepping foot on an American military base, shaking hands with the President of the United States. The symbolism is enormous, especially for those of us with Eastern European intuition. Russia has long treated Alaska symbolically, historically, and sometimes even provocatively. And seeing Putin welcomed there, not just in Washington, not in a neutral arena, but on a military base, sends a very dangerous signal. This signal is not only sent to NATO, but also directly to Moscow. The significance of gestures cannot be overstated. Imagery matters. Authoritarian regimes always read meaning into symbolism. And this meeting said, "Despite your aggression, you are still welcome here. Despite your attacks, you are still respected. I still desire a personal relationship in spite of your actions." That is not deterrence. That is indulgence. And authoritarian leaders do not respond to indulgence with gratitude. They respond with escalation. Trump's body language tells its own story. Even beyond diplomacy, even beyond rhetoric, Trump's interactions with Putin were unusual. Whenever they met, Trump seemed almost deferential, shoulders slightly lowered, tone softened, eyes less confrontational. And psychology matters in geopolitics. Body language shapes perception. Putin is a former intelligence officer. He reads people professionally. He identifies weaknesses instinctually. And he recognized something in Trump, something that made Trump easier to manipulate than previous U.S. presidents. This doesn't mean Trump was controlled. It means Trump was predictable. And predictability is the worst possible trait when dealing with a KGB-trained autocrat. Why this relationship matters so much to Central Europe. Here's where our perspective becomes crucial. When two nuclear powers dance around each other, the entire world trembles. But Central and Eastern Europe, we don't tremble, we calculate. Because we've lived through the consequences of American weakness and Russian expansionism. Our survival depends on understanding patterns, reading signals, and recognizing danger early. So when we saw Trump consistently downplaying Russian aggression, questioning NATO commitments, weakening alliances, and admiring Putin's strength, we didn't see it as a quirky personality trait. We saw it as a risk vector. Because if America becomes confused about who its enemies are, if American leadership becomes friendly to hostile powers, if alliances built over decades suddenly feel unstable, Russia advances, always. History proves this pattern again and again. The relationship as a warning sign. The Trump-Putin dynamic isn't about ideology. It isn't about conspiracy. It isn't even about corruption. It's about instinct. Trump's instinct to admire strength, and Putin's instinct to exploit that admiration. And that combination, whether intentional or not, creates a dangerous geopolitical cocktail. The combination of Trump's desire for strongman approval and Putin's desire for Western weakness creates a dangerous geopolitical cocktail. Trump doesn't fully understand Putin's worldview. Putin fully understands Trump's. And that imbalance, that asymmetry, is the heart of the danger. It isn't the scandals. It isn't the headlines. It isn't the conspiracy theories. It's the psychology. It's instinctual alignment. It's the unspoken admiration that tilts geopolitics in the wrong direction. This is why, to many of us in Central and Eastern Europe, Trump's relationship with Putin has never looked like diplomacy. It has always looked like a warning. The Epstein connection. Associations that matter. Now, let's address a topic that needs to be handled with care. Not because we should avoid it, but because it's a perfect example of how associations shape perception, even when there is no direct evidence of wrongdoing. I'm talking, of course, about Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. Let me start with what we do know, the documented facts, not speculation, not conspiracy, not internet gossip. Trump and Epstein moved in the same social circles for years. They attended the same parties. They shared connections in the New York and Florida elite nightlife scenes. There are photos of them together. There are statements from Trump himself, at one point calling Epstein a terrific guy. And there are testimonies from people who saw them interact. These are facts, public, verifiable facts. Later, Trump famously distanced himself from Epstein. He claimed they had a falling out. He said they weren't close. And yes, after Epstein's criminal activities resurfaced, Trump made sure to emphasize that he was not a fan. But distancing yourself after a scandal isn't exactly unusual. It's survival. Politicians do it. Celebrities do it. Anyone with a public image does it. So let's be clear. There is no proven evidence that Trump participated in Epstein's crimes. None. And I'm not here to accuse him of something the record doesn't support. That's not my style. And it's not what this podcast is about. But here's the deeper point, the one that actually matters. Your associations reveal something about you. Not legally, not criminally, but psychologically, socially, culturally. The kind of people you gravitate toward says something about your worldview. The pattern, not the scandal. Trump has always been drawn to a very particular kind of person. These are individuals of high status who exude an aura of power. These individuals operate beyond moral boundaries. These are men who set their own rules, don't fear consequences, and base their identity on dominance. Epstein was one of those men. So were others in Trump's orbit. This is not a coincidence, it's a pattern. These are people who thrive in the gray zones of morality and legality. These individuals perceive the world not as a community, but rather as a marketplace of influence, leverage, and pleasure. These individuals hold the belief that rules apply to others, not to themselves. When you consistently surround yourself with individuals like this, it doesn't automatically make you guilty of their actions. But it does reveal something important about what you admire, what you tolerate, and what you consider normal. Why this matters in a political context. In politics, character isn't measured only by what you do. It's also measured by who you choose to stand next to. When a future president willingly surrounds himself with billionaires with questionable ethics, political strongmen, power players with dark histories, entertainment figures who later become infamous, it paints a picture, a psychological portrait. This is not a legal portrait, but rather a symbolic one. This portrait shows a person drawn to environments where power is exercised without accountability, pleasure and influence blend together in private settings, moral boundaries are ambiguous, adaptable, and subject to negotiation. And this matters when such a person becomes the leader of a nation. Leadership plays a crucial role in shaping not only decisions, but also cultural norms. It signals what is acceptable and what isn't. The Eastern European perspective again. For us in Central and Eastern Europe, this isn't just gossip. It hits differently. We've seen countless politicians over the decades who fell into the orbit of oligarchs, shady businessmen, or morally questionable elites. We know how these associations slowly erode public trust. We know how they reshape decision-making. We know they create vulnerabilities, the kind authoritarian regimes love to exploit. So when Poles or Ukrainians or Lithuanians look at Trump standing next to Epstein in old photos, or praising him before his fall, we don't scream, "Aha! Evidence!" No. We simply raise an eyebrow and say, why is it always this type of person? What this says about Trump's judgment. Ultimately, what matters here is judgment, not guilt, not conspiracy, judgment. And Trump's history of associations consistently shows one thing. He tends to admire people who reflect his desires: power, control, impunity, wealth, and the ability to bend reality to their will. They are individuals who thrive without facing any repercussions. He admires individuals who have a commanding presence in the room. There are individuals who defy the rules and manage to get away with it. So no, this section isn't about proving Trump's involvement in anything. It's about understanding the psychology of proximity. Epstein is just one example, one symbol of a broader ecosystem of individuals Trump gravitates toward. People like him. These are individuals whom he holds in high regard, people who mirror his values back to him. This should compel anyone listening to sit up a little straighter. A government of yes men. The collapse of competence. Let's move to something that, in my view, reveals more about Donald Trump's leadership than any speech, rally, or debate performance ever could. And that is the simple, observable fact that Trump cannot tolerate competent people around him. This tolerance does not last long. Not if they challenge him. Not if they disagree with him. Not if they remind him that being president requires more than instinct and improvisation. No U.S. administration in modern history experienced the kind of turnover Trump's did. This isn't opinion. This is documented by institutions like the Brookings Institution, which tracked the departures in real time. Chiefs of staff, national security advisors, cabinet members, communications directors, press secretaries, policy specialists, and countless staffers came and went like disposable props in a political stage play. And let's be honest, 1 or 2 high-profile departures is normal. A dozen is concerning. But dozens upon dozens? That's not politics. That's dysfunction. The pattern of purging expertise. Whenever someone with real expertise pushed back, Trump reacted as if they had personally betrayed him. When military generals disagreed with him, he attacked them publicly. When intelligence agencies contradicted his statements, he dismissed their findings. When experienced diplomats advised caution, he ignored them. And what does this tell us? It tells us that Trump does not lead through collaboration. He leads through dominance. He wants subordinates, not advisors. Followers, not thinkers. People who will nod along, not people who will warn him when he's about to run off a cliff. Competence intimidated him. Intelligence threatened him. Independent thinking offended him. And so, one by one, the experts left, or were pushed out. Alternatively, they simply gave up. Who replaced them? This is where the story becomes even more troubling, because the people who lasted in Trump's orbit, the ones who replaced the experts, were not chosen for their qualifications. They were chosen for something far more dangerous: personal loyalty. Personal loyalty took precedence over experience. They prioritized loyalty over expertise. Loyalty took precedence over the interests of the nation. The people who lasted longest were those willing to reinterpret Trump's decisions for the public, no matter how incoherent. They were prepared to affirm Trump's correctness even when he made grave mistakes. They were prepared to modify their convictions to align with his mood on any given day. And this is the defining trait of a yes-man environment. Truth becomes irrelevant. Competence becomes irrelevant. Only the ego of the leader matters. Why this matters, especially in foreign policy. Having the right people in the room can make a significant difference when dealing with global crises, military strategy, and international diplomacy. This can make the difference between deterrence and provocation. Having the right people in the room can make the difference between peace and escalation. But Trump's inner circle was increasingly filled with people who were not there to provide insight. They were there to provide affirmation. And affirmation does not protect a nation. Affirmation does not defend alliances. Affirmation does not prevent wars. Affirmation protects one thing only: the ego of the leader. And an ego protected at all costs becomes dangerous, not only to its country, but to the entire geopolitical landscape. Authoritarian appeal and the strongman fantasy. Here's where it connects back to Trump's admiration for leaders like Putin, Kim Jong-un, and other strongmen. He envies their ability to govern without challenge, without dissent, without accountability. And so, consciously or unconsciously, Trump reshaped his administration to reflect that fantasy. Not a government of qualified professionals, but a court of loyalists orbiting a single central figure. This is how democracies weaken. Not overnight. This is not the result of a single catastrophic decision. Institutions gradually lose their ability to question, advise, or restrain the leader. And once a president stops hearing the truth, he becomes blind. And blind leaders make reckless decisions. Reckless decisions become crises. Crises become catastrophes. The Eastern European view: why we pay attention. For those of us in Central and Eastern Europe, the idea of a political leader surrounding himself with loyalists rather than experts is not theoretical. It's not abstract. It's not something we discuss academically. We have lived through this pattern. We have watched leaders replace independent thinkers with obedient servants. We have watched governments dismantle expertise in favor of political loyalty. And we know exactly how that story ends. With corruption, with stagnation. Institutions are often weakened. Foreign manipulation only exacerbated the situation. And sometimes, with invasion. So when we see a U.S. president governing like a man who envies autocrats rather than restraining them, it triggers alarm bells in our region. Loud ones. Because a United States led by a man who dismisses experts, purges advisors, and fills his circle with yes-men is a United States that cannot provide reliable leadership to Europe. And that instability, that uncertainty, gives Russia room to operate, expand, and push boundaries. The yes-man administration as a geopolitical warning. In the end, this isn't just about Trump's management style. It's about the consequences that a global superpower faces when it substitutes competence with obedience. Institutions weaken. Alliances fracture. Adversaries gain confidence. And the world becomes more dangerous. A president who cannot tolerate disagreement is a weak leader. He is a vulnerable one. And vulnerable leaders, especially those who believe they are strong, are the easiest kind for authoritarian regimes to manipulate. This is why Trump's yes-man administration isn't just a domestic issue. It is a geopolitical omen. This is a glimpse of what occurs when a superpower overlooks the fact that institutions, not individuals, are the source of strength. The Elon Musk bromance, the government shutdown, and the human cost of chaos. There's another example of Trump's leadership style that reveals how unstable, impulsive, and fundamentally transactional his relationships are, even with people he publicly claims to admire. I'm talking about his short-lived bromance with Elon Musk. For a brief moment, Musk seemed to believe he could influence Trump, steer him, and maybe even civilize some of his more chaotic impulses. Trump, meanwhile, loved the optics, a tech billionaire validating his presidency. But as always, Trump's admiration lasted only as long as the flattery did. The moment Musk disagreed with him, particularly on climate issues and international commitments, Trump turned cold, hostile, and almost resentful. One disagreement and the so-called friendship evaporated. It showed, once again, that Trump does not value long-term collaboration. He values loyalty that never challenges him. And when loyalty disappears, so does his interest. But if Trump's broken relationships with high-profile allies reveal something about his personal psychology, his behavior during the federal government shutdown reveals something far darker. Something about his willingness to inflict suffering on ordinary Americans to score political points. During the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, hundreds of thousands of federal workers went unpaid for weeks. These weren't wealthy elites. They weren't political insiders. They were TSA agents, food safety inspectors, Coast Guard members, and office clerks. People whose salaries barely covered their bills in the first place. Trump decided to go on the offensive, not against foreign adversaries, but against his employees. And he did it with shocking indifference. The situation became so dire for some sectors that American air traffic controllers, some of the most highly trained professionals in the U.S. workforce, began reaching out to their Swedish and Norwegian counterparts, asking about potential employment opportunities abroad. Think about that for a moment. American air traffic controllers are considering emigration because their government refused to pay them. That's not normal governance. That's not strength. That's not leadership. That's a level of dysfunction so profound that it threatens the very foundations of U.S. national stability. This moment showed Donald Trump at his best, as his critics would say, or rather, at his truest. It revealed what happens when a leader treats governance as a game, public service as leverage, and citizens as bargaining chips. The shutdown didn't frighten Trump. It didn't humble him. It didn't make him reconsider his approach. If anything, it emboldened him. Because in Trump's worldview, suffering is acceptable as long as it serves his image of dominance. And that is exactly the kind of worldview that terrifies those of us who live in regions where leaders like that have historically caused real damage. The bad omen, what Trump really symbolizes. Now we arrive at the heart of this entire episode, the real reason I chose to describe Donald Trump not as a messiah, not as a reformer, not as some misunderstood political genius, but as a bad omen. Because Trump, in my view, is not the origin of America's crisis. He is the symptom of a deeper and far more dangerous transformation unfolding within the United States. Great civilizations do not collapse because of one man. They collapse because their internal structures weaken long before the final blow arrives. Rome didn't fall the day the barbarians breached the gates. Rome fell when corruption eroded its institutions, when incompetence replaced merit, when citizens became spectators rather than participants, when the spectacle became more important than the state. Sound familiar? Trump is not the cause of America's decline. He is the reflection of it, the warning sign, the blinking red light on the dashboard. He is what happens when a nation grows so polarized, so exhausted, so distrustful of its own institutions that it elevates entertainment over expertise, instinct over intelligence, emotion over evidence. And this shift should terrify anyone who understands how fragile democracies actually are. Trump as a cultural symptom. When Trump rose to power, many people thought he represented a revolution. But revolutions build something new. Trump builds nothing. He destroys norms, fragments alliances, and destabilizes institutions, but he does not replace them with anything coherent. He is not a builder. He is a signal. He is the signal of a nation addicted to outrage, a nation that treats politics like a sport, a nation that chooses leaders the way it chooses TV characters, based on emotional resonance rather than competence. He represents the moment when citizens stop evaluating policies and start choosing personalities, the moment when truth becomes negotiable, when facts become optional, when the loudest voice in the room becomes the most authentic. These are not signs of a healthy democracy. These are the early tremors you feel before the earthquake. The Nobel Peace Prize obsession, a symbol of his hunger for validation. And while we're examining Trump as a symbol rather than a statesman, we cannot ignore one of his most revealing obsessions, his fixation on the Nobel Peace Prize. Trump wanted that award so badly, he practically begged for it in public. He complained at rallies that he deserved it more than Obama. He reminded his audiences again and again that he had been nominated. He hinted, not subtly, that world leaders should recognize him with the highest honor in global diplomacy. This wasn't the desire of a man committed to peace. It was the desire of a man desperate for validation, a man who craves recognition more than results, a man who wants the symbol of greatness without the responsibility that comes with it. In Poland, we joke about this, with that dark sense of humor Central Europe is famous for. We say that soon every butcher shop, every bakery, every chocolate factory will start awarding Donald Trump their own Peace Prize, just to keep him satisfied. Pan Donald, here is your golden kielbasa for advancing harmony in the meat industry. Pan Trump, please accept our platinum pierogi for your contributions to world peace. It's funny, but the underlying message is deadly serious. A leader who hungers for awards without earning them is a leader driven not by principle, but by ego. And ego-driven leaders are the easiest to manipulate. They can be swayed by flattery, influenced by applause, and led astray by those who know exactly which buttons to press. A man who chases trophies instead of truth cannot protect a nation. And a nation that encourages this behavior is in deep trouble. This obsession is not a side note. It is part of the Omen. Trump as an institutional stress test. America's institutions, the judiciary, the press, the intelligence community, Congress, state governments, have long acted as stabilizing forces. But during Trump's presidency, those institutions were tested harder than at any point since the Cold War. And what did we see? We saw cracks. We saw fractures. We saw political actors willing to undermine their own systems for short-term gain. Trump didn't create that willingness. He exposed it. When a single individual can cause this much chaos simply by exploiting existing weaknesses, it means those weaknesses were already there, dormant, ignored, underestimated. Trump just pressed the right buttons, or the wrong ones, depending on your view. Trump as a geopolitical omen. But for those of us living in Central and Eastern Europe, this is the part that matters most. America's instability is not just America's problem. It is our problem. When the United States starts questioning its role in the world, causing alliances to weaken, institutions to falter, and political leadership to become unpredictable, the entire global structure begins to tremble. The vacuum left behind never stays empty. Russia fills it, China fills it, authoritarianism fills it. These tremors are directly felt in Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and Romania. We do not observe America objectively. We watch it like a man watches the foundations of the house he is living in. If America fails to fulfill the stabilizing role it has played since 1945, the world that replaces it will not be benevolent towards nations like ours. This is why Trump is an omen. Not because of what he did, but because of what he reveals. He reveals the cracks in the American system. He reveals the fragility of its political culture. He reveals the danger of a public that prefers performance to policy. He reveals how an adversarial power can manipulate a leader who craves admiration more than truth. The omen of decline, if left unread. Every mighty empire has its warning signs. The moment historians later point to and say, yes, that was it. That was the turning point. Occasionally, the warning signs are subtle. Occasionally, they are loud. Occasionally, they come in the form of a leader who exposes weaknesses the system refuses to acknowledge. Trump is that warning sign. He is the living embodiment of America's political vulnerabilities. He is the forecast, not the storm. If Americans continue down this path, choosing theatrical certainty over real competence, choosing emotional narratives over rational governance, choosing loyalty to personalities over loyalty to democratic institutions, then the decline will accelerate. Not because Trump causes it, but because Trump showed that such decline is not only possible, it's popular. That is the true danger. That is why I call him a negative omen. This is not because he is inherently evil or dangerous, but rather because he represents the exact circumstances in which democracies falter and adversaries thrive. The omen is not the prophecy. The omen is a warning. The prophecy is what happens if the warning is ignored. Why I'm saying this? Not as a liberal, but as a friend of America. And before I move toward the closing of this episode, I want to say something important. something that might surprise you if you've been listening casually or if you're hearing my criticism of Donald Trump for the first time. You might assume that because I speak critically about Trump, I must represent the liberal side of the political spectrum. You might assume that I'm advocating for a woke or progressive stance. You might even assume I'm hostile to conservative values or Republican ideas. However, I can assure you that this is not the case. If I were a U.S. citizen, I would most likely consider myself a Republican. Not the MAGA version, not the populist wave, but a traditional Republican at heart. I firmly believe in the importance of institutions, international alliances, fiscal responsibility, measured diplomacy, a robust defense, and a leader who speaks softly but wields a formidable power. I do not criticize Donald Trump to gain applause from liberals. I do not criticize him for feeding the cultural wars. I do not criticize him because he scores ideological points. I criticize him because I care about the United States, and I care deeply. Not as an American, but as a European, one of millions whose safety, prosperity, stability, and geopolitical reality depend on a strong, united, rational United States. Because the truth is brutally simple. If we stand united, we win. If we are divided, we fall. This isn't a slogan. This is the entire backbone of the post-war Western order. When America leads with clarity and competence, Europe is secure. Europe shudders when America falters. When America is divided, autocracies are emboldened. When America is distracted, authoritarian forces advance. This is not theory. We see it, we feel it, we live it. Why Trump's behavior concerns me as a conservative-leaning observer. My criticism of Trump comes from a place of principle, not partisanship. It comes from a Republican-leaning worldview that values stability over chaos, alliances over isolation, competence over theatrics, and responsible leadership over impulsive spectacle. Trump violates all of these values, not because he is evil, but because he is fundamentally unmoored from the traditions that once defined conservative leadership in the United States. Cautious diplomacy, steady governance, respect for alliances, and the understanding that leadership requires humility, not just bravado. If anything, my criticism is rooted in disappointment. The disappointment of watching a political movement with a rich intellectual tradition become consumed by personality worship, conspiracy rhetoric, and emotional extremism. Watching Republicans, the party of Reagan, Eisenhower, and even Bush Sr., drift into a form of politics that destabilizes rather than strengthens the Western world order is painful. This is particularly painful for those of us who depend on America's stability more than Americans may realize. Europe needs America. America needs Europe. The West needs unity. This is the ultimate point. When I speak critically about Trump, I'm not taking sides in an American culture war. I am looking at the geopolitical chessboard from Central and Eastern Europe, from a region that knows exactly what happens when Western unity fractures. We've seen the consequences in our history books. We've seen them in our grandparents' stories. We've seen them in our wars, our borders, and our scars. A divided West is a vulnerable West, and Trump, intentionally or not, accelerates that division. My goal is not to attack America. It is to warn America. Not to undermine the Republican Party, but to encourage its return to seriousness and statesmanship. Not to praise liberal ideology, but to defend the system that has protected both sides of the Atlantic for 80 years. Because if America falters, Europe will not be far behind. And if the West collapses, the world that replaces it will be far darker, far harsher, and far more dangerous than anything we have known in our lifetimes. This is why I speak, not as a liberal. I am not speaking as a partisan. Instead, I approach the situation as a friend who is aware of the issues involved. The warning, the responsibility, and the invitation to think. So, after everything we've discussed today, after all the layers peeled back and all the illusions confronted, I want to leave you with something simple, something clear, something honest. This episode was not intended to persuade you. It was meant to warn you. Donald Trump is not the cause of America's crisis. He is the symptom, the mirror, the messenger. He unintentionally exposed the vulnerability of Western democracies to spectacle, emotion, and manipulation. He exposed the cracks in the very foundation that holds our world together. And before we end, I want to address one question you may have. Why didn't I mention certain names? Why didn't I make more direct accusations? The answer is simple. Those who follow current affairs, who read, observe, and pay attention, already know whom I'm referring to. They are capable of making connections without my guidance. And those who may find it difficult? Well, I invite you to explore the sources I'll place in the comments below. I want to help you form your own opinion, not force you to adopt mine. This is because knowledge, not loyalty, strengthens democracies. A final word on why this matters. I didn't record this episode to attack one man. I didn't record it to score political points. I didn't record it to fuel partisan fires. I recorded it because, as I said earlier, I care about the United States deeply. I care about the transatlantic bond. I care about the Western world that has kept nations like mine safe for decades. And I care because when America is strong, Europe is strong. When America is divided, Europe becomes vulnerable. When America hesitates, authoritarian powers advance. This is not ideology. This is not rhetoric. This is the quiet, sometimes uncomfortable reality of living in the 21st century. And Trump, whether you admire him, despise him, or feel something in between, stands as a symbol of the choices America must make. Choices that will determine whether the West remains united, or whether the world shifts into something far more dangerous. What happens next is up to us. A bad omen is not destiny. A warning is not doom. An alarm bell does not mean the building has collapsed. It means there is still time to act. And if there is one message I want you to take from this episode, it is this. We are strongest when we stand together. We are weakest when we let division control us. And the world will not wait while we figure that out. So wherever you are, in the US, in Europe, or anywhere in the world, think critically. Question everything. Look beyond personalities. Look beyond theatrics. Look beyond the noise. Strengthen your institutions. Demand competence. Reject chaos, no matter how entertaining it may seem. Because the future of our democratic world depends not on any single leader, but based on our collective ability to see the warning signs and choose something better. And before I move on, if you find value in these conversations, if you want to stay with me as we explore these uncomfortable truths together, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. It helps this young channel grow, and it keeps these discussions alive. And finally, thank you for spending this time with me. If you want sources, context, or additional readings, check the comments below. If something in this episode challenged you, good. If something made you uncomfortable, even better. That means you're thinking. That means you're awake. Let's keep talking. Let's keep questioning. Let's keep pushing for the kind of leadership the world actually needs, not the kind it memes into existence. And join me in the next episode, where we'll explore something more hopeful. Whether Poland is quietly entering its next golden age, and what might prevent it from getting there. Until then, stay sharp, stay curious, and as always, thank you for listening.